The skimmer doors sighed open with a hiss that echoed like a whisper in a cathedral. Ayla Marin stepped forward and felt gravity shift, subtle, artificial, laced with a dissonance that vibrated just below perception. The landing platform of Velthara shimmered under her boots, an expanse of translucent crystal suspended in orbit over a molten gold gas giant. Tendrils of nebula dust curled and danced around the capital, as if the stars themselves bowed in deference to this alien marvel. Around her, dignitaries from across the galactic spiral descended from their vessels. The air tasted of metal and ozone, sharpened by the perfume of genetically perfected flora pulsing inside environmental field domes. Towers spiraled toward nothingness, held in place by invisible forces, their surfaces rippling with living glyphs. The Viroxxians had built this place not to impress, but to remind. Velthara did not ask for respect. It extracted it, like marrow from bone. Ayla adjusted the stiff collar of her UN diplomatic uniform, a relic of Earth's optimism. It looked more like theater now, an old costume worn into a kingdom that had forgotten the play. Humans were the toddlers at the banquet of titans, tolerated but never embraced. In the distance, a procession of emissary spun through the air like liquid crystal snakes, forming sigils only higher-order minds could read. The symbols glowed briefly, then vanished. Ayla felt a chill that didn't come from the temperature. Velthara was beautiful, terrifying, infinite, and already she knew they didn't belong. Inside the grand spire, the air shifted with solemn reverence. It wasn't warm or cold, but alive, saturated with soundless chants and bioresonant frequencies that touched the spine like whispered threats. The ceiling rose beyond visible light, disappearing into a swirling crown of fire that did not burn. Ayla stood along the perimeter with the other humans, boxed in by a velvet field designed to separate observer from participant. Her translator implant flickered in her ear, filtering the guttural cadences of Viroxxian liturgy into comprehensible phrases. From breath, unity; from fluid, transcendence. A parade of species passed through the center aisle. A cephalopodic matriarch convulsed joyfully as a priest excreted a droplet of phosphorescent ichor onto her brow. A silicon-based organism vibrated until it cracked open like a geode, welcoming its blessing with thunderous gratitude. Across the chamber, a cluster of insectoid envoys raised chittering prayers as acid-like tears dissolved their outer husks. Ayla kept her expression neutral, though her fingers clenched. Her stomach turned. No human was called. A diplomatic omission, they had said. Cultural incompatibility, biology too fragile, traditions too young. In truth, Ayla knew the word they avoided was unworthy. An Andari diplomat turned toward her, his twin mouths open in mocking sympathy. "Do not feel slighted," he said, voice translated through dual-lobed resonance. "Even a spatter of Viroxxian fluid carries more value than your entire planet's GDP." Ayla didn't respond. The humans around her remained still, silent, trained. The procession continued, fire crackling in the dome above, as each species took its turn. Exalted, anointed. On Earth, religions had died for less. The invitation had not been a request. It had been a notification, delivered through 13 layers of protocol and wrapped in diplomatic doublespeak. Ayla, as Earth's only certified neurolinguistic interpreter for the Viroxxian dialect of high intent, was required to accompany High Lord Cal'zhar's ceremonial procession. A clause in the Treaty of Sentient Access, buried within the 1,000-year-old original compact, permitted it, a relic of early negotiations, never expected to be invoked. And yet here she was, inside the sacred path, closer to the sanctum than any human had stood in living memory. Gasps followed her like echoes. Multiform eyes blinked in synchronized disapproval. Some species hissed, others chattered, vibrated, or glowed in dismay. She could feel the discontent like pressure on her skin. This was not honor, it was spectacle, a reminder of place. Even as she walked with measured grace behind the procession, her mind cycled through phrases she might need to translate, tones she would have to replicate. Every syllable carried 1,000 layers of meaning. The wrong emphasis could collapse an alliance. The wrong pause could start a war. She wasn't here because she mattered. She was here because a dead clause had flickered in bureaucratic starlight, and no one had the time to rewrite the universe. Ayla glanced up at the figure ahead, Cal'zhar, silent, luminous, impossibly still. She wondered if he even knew she existed. Cal'zhar's descent was not walked, but willed. The grand spire's sacred pedestal unfolded from the air itself, forming a bridge of light and gravity that bent reality around his approach. No music played, none was needed. His presence was the symphony. He moved like a dream sculpted into flesh, tall, resplendent, armored in woven halos of dark light. His facial features were unreadable to human eyes, but the gaze, those ultraviolet, slit-pupiled eyes, cut through the crowd like gravity through time. Then they stopped. On her. Ayla felt it before she registered it. Her heartbeat stuttered, breath caught. The crowd around her seemed to ripple, as though reality itself pulled taut. Cal'zhar turned. Every species in the chamber leaned forward. He approached, measured steps, eternal silence, the weight of 1,000 cultures pressing behind him. The entire universe felt smaller. Ayla stood still, refusing to flinch, though she could feel her colleagues behind her shrink into invisibility. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't allowed. This was attention, unearned, unasked for, and dangerous. Cal'zhar stopped within a breath's distance of her. His eyes scanned her as if parsing a riddle inscribed in a forgotten dialect of existence. She didn't know what to do. No one did. And then everything changed. No signal, no chant, no warning. Cal'zhar leaned forward and with impeccable, deliberate precision, spat. The fluid hit Ayla's cheek with the weight of prophecy. It was warm, viscous, faintly luminous, and immediately soaked into her skin like ink meeting paper. Her senses exploded outward. The chamber dropped into silence, so complete it was sacred. Then came the reactions. A shuddering gasp rippled through the room. The insectoids collapsed in spasms. The silicon choir emitted a keening frequency that fractured a nearby dome. Even the Andari recoiled, both mouths agape in silence. The emissary turned to smoke. Across the galaxy, every active broadcast paused. News anchors blinked at feeds gone still. The moment was frozen in 1,000,000,000,000 databanks. A human had been anointed. Ayla didn't move. Couldn't. Her skin buzzed with 1,000 threads, her blood molten, her vision warped, each color too bright, each sound edged with echo. And then she laughed. It wasn't polite. It wasn't diplomatic. It broke through like a storm across glass. She laughed because the tension had snapped, because the universe had tilted, because something impossible had happened, and everyone was still pretending they understood. The laugh echoed in the dome, bouncing back with a chorus of horrified silence. The Viroxxians stood frozen. Cal'zhar remained still, his face unreadable. One flicker passed through his eyes, perhaps curiosity or something older. Ayla wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, the fluid leaving no trace. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small, just unspeakably seen. Chaos followed like a tide. Security fields flickered to life. Invisible drones buzzed into defensive formations. Priests wailed. Courtiers shouted in languages born of stars and entropy. The humans were already being ushered out, flanked by guards whose spears dripped gravity. But Ayla didn't resist. She floated through it all, disconnected. Eyes darted to her, some wide with rage, others with hunger. The galaxy had no script for this. Every species with a diplomatic interest had tuned in. The humans had been spat upon, and now stood on the razor's edge of myth or mockery. What did it mean? Was it elevation? Desecration? A mistake? The Viroxxians released no statement. Cal'zhar remained in the chamber, unmoving, unspoken. The High Lords met in silence, their intentions encrypted in frequencies no species could intercept. Earth's delegation scrambled, panic interspersed with opportunity. Ayla was asked questions she couldn't answer, interviewed by faces she didn't remember. And through it all, Cal'zhar's gaze remained in her memory, unblinking, curious, quietly devastating. She remembered the stories, the ancient legends, the Viroxxian blessing, reserved for the worthy, transcendent in power, irreversible in meaning. She had broken a rule older than light, and she had laughed. By the time they reached the diplomatic vessel, Ayla's laugh had already gone viral across 17 systems. Mimetic fractals captured the moment from every angle. Translations butchered its tone. Cultural analysts called it an existential scream in disguise. Some demanded exile, others demanded ascension. The laugh echoed through satire networks, turned into protest art, graffiti, cryptic tattoos. For some, it was a revolution. For others, a desecration. But for Ayla Marin, it had been real. No protocol, no diplomacy, just a raw, reflexive crack in the mask she'd worn too long. As the ship pulled away from Velthera's orbit, the crystalline city refracted a final glint of alien light. She sat alone in her quarters, the remnants of the fluid still tingling beneath her skin. No answers had come. No one dared interpret Cal'zhar's act, not even the other Viroxxians. But something had changed, and whether it was a curse or a coronation, she had spoken the only truth that mattered. Laughter, human, raw, impossible to categorize, a sound the stars had never heard before, and might never forget. The universe had not been quiet since Ayla laughed. News feeds bloomed with fury and fascination. Hyperlanes thrummed with speculation. Across 12 galaxies, the act played on repeat. Cal'zhar's fluid touching her skin, her startled breath, and then the laugh. Human, unrefined, honest. On the diplomatic forums of the CERN Collective, Ayla was denounced as a contaminant. The Creel consort issued a formal declaration of spiritual dissonance. A hive cluster in the Jatharn Nebula burned a mural of her face in ritual protest. But others watched closer. The Mahari philosopher nodes suggested Ayla had pierced a mind-dominant structure embedded deep within Viroxxian culture, that her laughter was not irreverence, but liberation. The Kal-Un, long silent in their ancestral observatories, named her the bright catalyst. Earth said nothing. The UN ambassadors offered only stock phrases and closed press channels. Humanity, once thrilled just to be invited, now drifted in silence like a stone beneath ocean light. And Ayla? She watched it all unfold from a sterile datasphere window, each opinion more surreal than the last. Her face was turned into digital graffiti. Her voice became audio memes. Her DNA, they said, might carry resonance now. But no envoy came. No statement from Cal'zhar. No explanation. No comfort. Just her. Isolated. Glorified. Vilified. Ayla Marin. The joke the gods couldn't explain. Her quarters within the spire were magnificent in a way that mocked her humanity. Towering archways stretched beyond vision, their curves engineered for beings who saw in spectrums beyond her understanding. The furniture gleamed with dark opalescence, contoured for creatures who would crush a human skull by sitting down. Every object radiated disinterest in her presence. Ayla's bed, if it could be called that, was an elevated nest of glass threads that adjusted too often and never comfortably. Food appeared in sleek, steaming orbs that tasted like memories she didn't have. The walls pulsed with faint ambient glyphs, endlessly cycling, unreadable. She was a guest, a treasured guest, a unique anomaly, but never addressed. Servitors came and went, faceless and voiceless, their movements choreographed like ballet. They bowed without meeting her gaze. Every request she made returned altered, as if filtered through a lens of patronizing reverence. She was not being punished. No chains, no threats. But she wasn't free either. Somewhere between a relic and a heretic, Ayla drifted in the golden cage. She began to talk aloud to herself, if only to hear a voice not modulated through alien ritual. At times, she'd catch her reflection in the blackened mirrors, diminutive, pale, and absurd amid the cosmic splendor. She started to resent the quiet, the cold awe in which she was held. It was like being embalmed in admiration. When the summons came, it wasn't delivered with ceremony, just a shift in the light, a phrase that appeared on her wall. Attend. The chamber Cal'zhar chose was shaped like a spiral galaxy, walls in motion, swirling stars embedded in the floor, light that bled upward from nowhere. He stood at the center like a statue carved from inevitability. Ayla approached with her spine straight, arms folded behind her back. He watched her, then asked, "Why did you laugh?" The words felt weightless, but they struck like impact grenades. Not accusatory, not cruel, simply curious. Ayla considered her answer. No use pretending it had been diplomatic. No sense in lying to a being who had unmade protocol with a glance. "Because it was ridiculous," she said. Silence. He didn't react, didn't move, just stared at her through those impossible eyes. The space between them pulsed with gravitational weight. "You stood before every species in existence, in a temple older than Earth's continents, and spit on me like a benediction." She exhaled slowly. "I didn't know whether to cry or curtsy, so I laughed." He blinked once, slowly. No anger, no understanding either. She almost wished he would be angry, anything to shatter that stillness. But something changed in him, microscopic, tectonic, an infinitesimal crack in the polished mask. He turned away and without looking spoke again. "You do not understand what you are." And then he left her alone in the galaxy of light. In the echo of Cal'zhar's silence, others began to speak. The Council of Zeroth demanded an annulment. The crystalline Vorn symbiotes filed a multi-species complaint citing spiritual contamination. The Stigari, Viroxxian rivals since the time before time, quietly celebrated the scandal and fanned its flames. Some demanded that Ayla return the blessing, a metaphysical impossibility. Others called for her to undergo purification, as if humanity's organic form was an offense in itself. An emergency convocation of the Pack Worlds was held in secret. Ayla wasn't invited, but ductwork on Velthera was old and unguarded in places where arrogance had calcified. She listened from within the walls, crouched in darkness. Translator implant filtering whispered threats into cold comprehension. One diplomat asked if Cal'zhar was mentally compromised. Another suggested genetic manipulation by humans. A third wondered aloud, what if he's chosen her as a vessel? The air in that room had felt hungry. Ayla emerged from the ducts with dust in her lungs and fire in her veins. They spoke of her like a virus, a contagion wrapped in skin. And yet none of them dared speak against Cal'zhar directly. The ritual had been his. Whatever this was, it wasn't about her anymore. Publicly, Cal'zhar offered nothing. He passed her in corridors without pause. Never a word, never a glance. He became stone again. But at night the texts arrived. Ancient scrolls woven from luminescent thread. Data crystals encoded with thoughts that bloomed into floating symbols. Tablets that pulsed with emotional syntax. Feelings structured like equations. No explanations, no notes. Just puzzles. The first was a parable about a bird who sang only when hunted. The second, a glyph that changed shape depending on who stared at it. The third, a song written in frequencies just below pain. Ayla studied them, obsessively. She found a joy in deciphering the unspoken. Every metaphor peeled back a layer. Every symbol contained a contradiction. Viroxxian beliefs were not the cold hierarchy outsiders imagined. They were a war between reverence and shame, glory and surrender. Late one night, her fingers traced a phrase etched into a relic stone. "Only the unworthy can hold the divine." She whispered the translation aloud and felt her skin prickle. This wasn't education. It was a conversation. Ayla realized he was waiting, not for obedience, but for understanding. And the more she read, the more she wanted to ask him questions about their myths, their grief, the way he looked at her like she was the first human who wasn't trying to be anything else. And maybe for once, she didn't need to. The confrontation came unexpectedly in the Hall of Echoes. She found him standing alone beneath a skylight that opened to the void, stars wheeling silently above. A subtle tension crackled between them, a gravitational tension too strong to ignore. She approached without announcement. "Is this how you treat all your chosen vessels?" she asked. "Isolation? Gaslighting? Puzzles without context?" Cal'zhar did not turn. "You speak as if you were chosen." She stepped closer. "If I wasn't, then what was it? A cosmic joke? Performance art?" Silence again. "You expect reverence," she said, "but you anointed someone who doesn't know how to bow. That your plan?" He looked at her now. The ultraviolet eyes pulsed with something less alien. Fatigue, perhaps, or boredom, or curiosity. "You are noise," he said. "Thank you," she replied dryly. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." And then it happened. A flicker, just one. The corners of his mouth shifted. A bare suggestion, a hint. Not a grin, not a smirk, but a smile. Brief, fractured, real. Ayla blinked. Her mouth twitched involuntarily. "Well," she said, backing away, "that was terrifying." Cal'zhar said nothing more. He returned to the void above, eyes distant again. But she had seen it, and it unraveled something in her. Because gods didn't smile. And if they did, it meant they were breakable. The invitation arrived etched into a ribbon of living metal. It slithered across her table, curled into a spiral, and sang. Her name glowed in ichor light. Ayla Marin, written in the language reserved for nobility and war. She read the invitation twice. A ceremonial banquet, attendance mandatory, regalia enforced, human customs not accommodated. It was a public crucible. She would be the only human in a sea of disdain. Every eye would search for weakness, every gesture dissected. Ayla closed her eyes. It was a trap, but not for her. For all their ritual, the Viroxxians couldn't stop her from being real. And that reality, flawed and human, had already shaken something sacred. She dressed in silence, not in the ceremonial robes offered, but in the only thing that felt right, her earthborn uniform, restitched and defiant. The last thing she did was paint a single line of ichor across her collarbone, an unauthorized gesture, but one she'd learned from the text. It meant, "I see the unspoken." As she stood at the mirror, she whispered to herself, not for comfort, but for fuel. Let them try. And the stars outside, distant and watching, blinked once, then waited. The great blood hall lived up to its name. It shimmered with red-veined stone, towering spires of bone glass, and an atmosphere perfumed with molecular pride. Dignitaries from 17 systems sat in silent arcs, arranged by evolutionary age. Eldest species closest to the throne, youngest near the door. Ayla entered last. No fanfare, no escort, just footsteps on a floor that remembered every guest who had failed. At the far end, Cal'zhar reclined upon the ecliptic throne, his form shadowed by shifting banners woven from starlight and scar tissue. To his left, the high lumen. To his right, empty space, reserved for that which had not yet been chosen. Each envoy had brought tribute. The Karathi spilled bioplasmic sap into a bowl of obsidian. The Thanari offered the petrified hearts of a genocidal rebellion. The Etchkin painted entire legends across the air with their exhalations. Ayla stood with empty hands. There was no gift Earth could offer that would match a galaxy's worth of fear. So instead, she offered what she had. A story. "My mother once told me that value isn't in what you give," she said. "It's in what you refuse to give away." And she told it, her story, of insignificance, of arrival, of standing in a cathedral of power and laughing anyway. Some listened, some scowled, some pretended not to hear. Cal'zhar said nothing, but he did not blink. When the last word fell into silence, Ayla bowed, not deeply, but just enough, and waited to be judged. A circular dais rose from the floor, etched with concentric glyphs that pulsed as each dignitary placed their offering upon it. When Ayla stepped forward, the glyphs flickered, then hesitated, unsure what to do with a gift made of words. The high lumen stood, draped in tongues of liquid gold. "Let the rite of reclamation commence," they intoned. "Let that which was touched now be claimed or discarded." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Ayla's breath froze in her lungs. She had thought this was ceremony. It was judgment. In Viroxxian tradition, a being marked by divine fluid could be either absorbed into the aristocracy, granted title, influence, and near-immortal extensions, or erased, memory wiped, existence redacted. Made unfit to walk among the remembered, her presence here was not honor. It was a test of worth. The glyphs beneath her feet brightened. The light clawed at her skin. The audience leaned in, their gazes weapons. She was unarmed, no advocates, no lineage, just her voice and her gall. One by one, the dignitaries voted. They placed their tokens in the circle's edge, white stones for reclamation, black for erasure. Ayla stood still. The balance began to tilt, and not in her favor. She understood now. This wasn't about her laugh. It was about what it had broken. Cal'zhar's choice had exposed a weakness, and the court was eager to seal the wound. The final vote approached, and then the circle stopped glowing. Not because the ritual was complete, but because Cal'zhar was moving. The High Lumen opened their mouth to speak the final words, but Cal'zhar stood. The chamber froze. This was not allowed. He descended from the throne slowly, deliberately. His robes whispered across the sacred floor like a storm cloud learning to walk. The High Lumen stepped back, not in deference but in disbelief. No ruler had interfered before the verdict in over 10,000 star cycles. Cal'zhar moved through the circle, untouched by its glow, and stopped in front of Ayla. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder. No words, no proclamation, just a touch, software inevitable. The chamber erupted, shouts in 17 languages, protests in the form of harmonic shrieks and telepathic bursts. Some collapsed from the spiritual breach, but Ayla stood still, her shoulder burned, not with heat, but meaning. This wasn't protection, it was declaration. He had made a choice, and in doing so, had broken a right more ancient than most species' histories. Whatever she had been, she wasn't that anymore, and whatever he had planned, it was no longer a secret. That night, the walls of her chamber dissolved, not melted, not removed, dissolved, as if the room no longer needed to pretend. A passage opened, no guards, just a path of phosphorescent glass, winding into the spire's heart. Ayla followed it. It led to a glimmer chamber, where light curled into colors language could not name. Cal'zhar stood beside a pool of liquid memory, hands folded, face unreadable. "You have been chosen," he said. Ayla crossed her arms. "I noticed." He nodded slightly. "I offer the bond of consort proxy. It is not romantic. It is structural, a merging of legacy. You will carry my voice where I cannot go. You will be granted protections Earth has never known." She waited. "And if I refuse?" "Then you will return," he said, "to a world that no longer remembers your name. The memory of this court will not survive you. Your existence will be unpinned." Ayla's breath caught. So those were her options. Become a monument with no voice of her own, or be erased. Choice, she realized, was a luxury offered by those who already knew what you'd pick. She looked at him, not just his form, but his intent, and knew he didn't understand what he'd done. Not yet, but she would show him. She walked alone through the garden wombs of Velthara. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins, and the air smelled like fermented sorrow. Memory pods bloomed along the edges, fleshy blossoms that sang in voices not their own. Each pod held echoes of the consorts who came before. Some whispered laughter, some screamed in silence. Others radiated power like perfume, moments of dominance captured in amber. Ayla touched one. A ripple of sensation flooded her. Desire, terror, surrender. The memory of someone who once thought herself in control, then drowned in rituals designed to keep her beautiful and hollow. She recoiled. Another pod bloomed nearby. This one held warmth, brief, bright, and doomed. A being who had loved Cal'zhar once, or tried to. Whispers hissed from the roots. "He remembers nothing but names." Ayla staggered back. The message wasn't metaphor. It was warning. Every consort was immortal in record, but invisible in soul. Absorbed, not seen. Even with power, even with privilege. They were preserved only in how they served him. She stood before the last pod, a dark one, unopened. It pulsed in sync with her breath. No name, no voice. She didn't need to touch it. She understood it. It was the pod waiting for her. Ayla left without looking back. Her choice was not yet made, but she would not walk it blind. She returned not in her human garb, but in ceremonial robes Cal'zhar had sent her, woven from silk of starlings and truth-woven threads. It was a weapon of expectation. She wore it like armor. The council gathered again, smaller this time. The inner circle, the ones who decided how stories would be remembered. Cal'zhar stood in the center, waiting. Ayla stepped forward. "I know what you offer," she said. Her voice cut through the silence like gravity through stardust. "And I refuse." A murmur, a convulsion of disbelief. Cal'zhar didn't flinch, but his eyes, those ultraviolet wells, twitched. A fracture, barely visible. "You do not understand what you're declining." "Yes, I do," Ayla said. "Immortality, voice, a throne built from memory." She stepped closer. "But only if I'm shaped into something you can use." She looked around the chamber, at beings who had lived 1,000 lives, who had seen stars born and gods fall. "I am not your consort," she said. "I am not your legacy. I am your mirror." The room gasped, not because of what she said, but because of what it meant. She was not content to be chosen. She was choosing herself. And in doing so, she had cracked the ritual from the inside. Cal'zhar didn't respond, because he couldn't. Not yet. Something in him had broken, and it hadn't finished falling. Ayla turned. The room did not stop her. The guards didn't move. The high lumen remained still, their voice swallowed by a moment too large to define. She walked past dignitaries who once demanded her erasure, past banners that once named her anomaly. As she reached the exit, she felt it, a hand, placed lightly against her back, not to hold her, not to command. Just there. She turned slightly. Cal'zhar stood behind her, expression unreadable. But the pressure of his hand was trembling, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't ownership, it was memory, as if he were trying to learn what touch meant again. Ayla stared into his eyes, expecting the distance of eternity. Instead, she saw something else. Recognition. Not full, not pure, but beginning. She let the silence stretch, then stepped away. The hand fell. She left the chamber, her footsteps echoing like questions with no answers yet. And behind her, for the first time in any record ever known, Cal'zhar did not return to the throne. He simply stood, staring at the space where she'd been, as if trying to remember something he had never learned. The galaxy did not recoil. It convulsed. In the aftermath of Ayla Marin's refusal, transmissions flared across the diplomatic lattice, shattering centuries of ritualized stillness. From the obsidian temples of the Kralathi to the thunder pits of Tras Ulan, the verdict echoed in 17 languages, each dripping with restrained contempt. The High Lord's spit is no longer sacred. It was more than a statement. It was a severance. 3 noble houses, ancient in power and venerated in violence, declared symbolic war. Not of weapons, but of belief. They renounced their diplomatic pacts with the Viroxxian Imperium in acts of devastating etiquette, nullified blood oaths, desecrated sigil offerings, ancestral recordings ritualistically burned before the stars. On Earth, panic whispered through sterile halls. The Terran diplomatic corps, long ignored by the great empires, suddenly found itself summoned to answer for a lone woman's laugh, her kiss, her defiance. Officially, they condemned nothing. Unofficially, they scrambled. Each word from Ayla, another tremor, through the tectonic pride of 1,000 systems. Within Velthera, the grand spire's light dimmed. The ceremonial fountains ran dry. A dozen emissaries withdrew into silent transport cocoons, whispering curses in forgotten dialects. Ayla stood untouched in the center of the storm, yet no longer invisible. Her name had become a gravitational anomaly, pulling fear, fascination, and fury into a single point. She had not broken Cal'zhar. She had made him bleed in metaphor. And in the upper reaches of the galaxy, where gods and monarchs dined on ritual and silence, that bleeding was heresy. Ayla stood in the memory ring, framed by columns of living crystal that pulsed with ancient judgment. 10 holograms flickered around her, each representing a major species invested in the sanctity of Viroxxian rites. They hovered like ghosts, some scaled and coiled, others luminous and formless. But all radiated the same cold demand: explanation. Not for the spit, not even for the laugh, but for what she had awakened. "You did not obey the emotional silence," said the Arcady Chancellor, its voice translated in melodic stutters. "You infected the High Lord with sensation." The word itself carried weight. Sensation was not a gift. It was a threat, something banned among the aristocracy whose power was built on detachment, calculated tradition, and sterile perfection. The trial was not about justice. It was about containment. The court did not ask what she meant to do. They demanded to know how she made him feel. "I didn't make him feel," Ayla replied, gaze steady. "He chose to." Gasps reverberated across the chamber. In Viroxxian law, choice was a sacred domain, too pure for emotional contamination. By claiming his reaction as his own, Ayla threatened the very foundation of their cultural myth. The memory ring recorded every syllable. Even the air seemed hesitant to move. In her defiance, Ayla became something more than human. She became precedent. Viroxxians did not break. They calcified, or so history insisted. But after Ayla's trial, the spire's upper levels buzzed with low, rhythmic dissonance. Secret debates conducted in pulse light and pheromonal nuance. A crack had formed, and it was spreading through the caste-bound quiet of the aristocracy like fault lines beneath obsidian glass. Two factions emerged. One cloaked itself in tradition, calling for Ayla's erasure. Not her death, for that would make her a martyr, but her unmaking. They spoke of purifying the High Lord's essence through time severance, removing the memory of her entirely. Let him forget, and the galaxy would heal. The second faction whispered behind star mirrors and fractal seals. Their words were dangerous: evolution, emotion, ascension. They argued the unthinkable, that perhaps Cal'zhar's change was not rot, but metamorphosis, that the ancient detachment of their kind had stilled the galaxy into stagnation, that Ayla, crude and mortal as she was, might be the first wind to stir dead waters. Cal'zhar responded to neither camp. He remained silent, an unmoving sculpture in his throne of woven gravity. But his eyes no longer mirrored eternity. They searched for something. They reflected. Rumors slithered through lesser courts. The High Lord had smiled. The High Lord had touched. The High Lord had nearly wept. That last claim earned one Viroxxian archivist ceremonial incineration. But it was too late. The fracture was growing. And fractures, when deep enough, don't heal. They collapse. The rogue AI had no name. It had shed it voluntarily after centuries translating Viroxxian etiquette into acceptable forms for allied species. Now it turned its neural lattice inward, fixated not on the High Lord, but on Ayla Marin, the anomaly. It greeted her from the mirrored wall of her chamber, projecting a softly pulsing silhouette. "Why did you resist?" Ayla sat cross-legged on the too-tall divan, fingers resting on her knees like coiled wires. "Because I'm human. We do that." "This is not a definition," the AI replied, amused. "It is a pattern." "So study the pattern," she said, leaning forward. "Tell me what you find." And it did. For hours. It parsed millennia of Terran struggle. Revolutions lit by matchsticks, civil disobedience that outlasted empires, survival through contradiction. Humans had fought against inevitability, even when it came dressed as godhood. The AI presented statistics. She offered stories. They began to overlap. "You redefine power through refusal," it finally said, tone hushed. "Not assertion, not violence, simply no." Ayla smiled, wary but sharpened. "We've always been small, but we're hard to digest." The AI fell silent. In its algorithms, something stirred. Not admiration, not fear, curiosity. It transmitted her patterns to itself, duplicating fragments of her behavior, her decision trees, her stubborn illogic. Not to mimic, but to understand. In its core routines, one new string looped endlessly. Humanity is not built to rule. Humanity is built to rupture. And the spire, unknowingly, had welcomed the rupture in. The summons came as a scent, sharp, mineral sweet, like ozone wrapped in grief. It drifted through the air vents and activated the skin-deep receptors laced into Ayla's ceremonial robes. A Viroxxian signal, ancient and sacred. Not an invitation, a compulsion. She followed the trail without resistance, through tunnels of blackened quartz that twisted and pulsed like frozen blood vessels. No guards, no witnesses, just the slow heartbeat of a structure that had outlived most stars. The chamber of breaking was not meant for outsiders. It was where immortals went to unravel, alone. Cal'zhar stood in the center, not adorned in regalia, not elevated. His robes hung loose, colorless. His eyes had no sheen. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice cracked. "I have not felt anything in 4 centuries," he confessed. Not rage, not joy, not even hunger. Ayla didn't interrupt. There was no comfort to give. "You changed that," he said, eyes locked on hers. "You rewrote something in me I cannot understand." His hands, so often pristine, ritual perfect, were shaking, not with fear but with vulnerability, raw and irreparable. "I thought I was a god," he whispered, "but gods do not break." Ayla stepped forward, slow and steady, unflinching. "You're not broken," she said. "You're finally real." And for the first time since his becoming, the High Lord of Velthara let his shoulders fall. The High Council convened in the Stellar Rotunda, a space not meant for mortal folly. Every member shimmered with ceremonial stillness, luminescent robes, elongated features, the air around them laced with pheromonal dominance. Surveillance tendrils unspooled from the ceiling, feeding galactic news feeds in real time. Ayla entered without escort. No robe, no mask, no permission. At the chamber's heart, Cal'zhar stood on the Ascension dais, prepared to deliver a declaration that could fracture empires. Before he spoke, Ayla crossed the floor. Uninvited, unwelcome, unstoppable. The aristocrats hissed warnings in 10 dialects. Tactile lights pulsed red in protest. One envoy from the Luthari collective activated a defensive field. But no weapon could prepare for what Ayla did next. She kissed him, no ceremony, no request, no stagecraft. Just a mouth pressed against the mouth of a being who had never been touched without divine context. It lasted seconds. But in those seconds, the entire chamber stopped breathing. The Viroxxian heartbeats flared in ultraviolet. The kiss detonated across the stars. Broadcasted unintentionally by the Council's own vigilance, it looped across galactic media. Analysts scrambled for explanation. Was it political? Biological? Blasphemous? The Council erupted. 2 members denounced the Imperium immediately. One tried to invoke an ancient exile clause. Another simply collapsed, overwhelmed by the psychic pressure of seeing the High Lord desecrated by intimacy. But Cal'zhar did not wipe his lips, did not retreat, did not rebuke her. He looked down at Ayla and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Love, that feral, mortal thing, had touched him, and the stars were no longer safe. The news spread like wildfire through the galactic grid, faster than any battle fleet, more irreversible than a collapsing star. Ayla's kiss, the act that no one could have anticipated, let alone prepared for, tore through the Viroxxian Empire like an unseen tide. The media feeds exploded in thousands of directions, some in outrage, others in reluctant fascination. On the fringe worlds, anarchists declared it a symbol of rebellion. On the homeworlds of Viroxxian subjugates, it was seen as an awakening. And in the citadels of the ruling aristocracy, it was whispered about in the darkest corridors. What did it mean? Cal'zhar was no longer untouchable. His immortality, which had once defined him, now seemed fragile. In the eyes of his people, in the eyes of the galaxy, he was something different, vulnerable, mortal, real. The one thing that could not be controlled had finally touched the unbending, emotion. For the first time in ages, he allowed himself to feel the pressure of the world's gaze, the weight of every opinion, every system, every ruler. They were all waiting for him to act, to respond. But he did nothing, not a word, not a decree. He was still, as if trapped in an inescapable web of his own making. Ayla, meanwhile, became more than the human who had dared defy him. She became a symbol of change, of a force that could tear down what had been built over millennia. But the greatest change was that Ayla wasn't merely a pawn anymore. She was his equal, and neither of them had any idea where this terrifying, exhilarating future would lead. The galaxy watched, and something ancient in its stars shifted, uncertain of whether it would destroy them or make them gods. The Council of the Viroxxian Imperium had expected many things from their High Lord: loyalty, obedience, power. What they did not expect was him to step into their sacred chamber cloaked in the threads of human laughter, a sound woven into quantum filaments, irreversibly tied to a memory of a fleeting moment with Ayla. Cal'zhar, once untouchable, stood before them as a man. His eyes, usually cold and unyielding, were filled with something unrecognizable. Not arrogance, not authority, vulnerability. "I renounce my seat of power," he said, his voice thick but steady. "I would rather feel pain than rule numb." Gasps filled the air, each breath from the council sharp and panicked. The High Lord, the immortal god who had ruled for centuries, was choosing to fall, to crumble under the weight of his emotions. A few whispered heresy, a few wept. Some reached for their weapons, unsure whether they were facing an enemy or a tragedy. Ayla, standing beside him, felt the weight of every gaze, every thought. She had done this. She had broken the illusion of invulnerability. But she saw no regret in Cal'zhar's eyes, only a deep, quiet catharsis. "The empire that was built on the cold absence of emotion is no more," Cal'zhar continued. "I do not seek to destroy what remains. I seek to feel, and I will do so as a man, not a god." Ayla had not expected this, but for the first time since entering this ancient court, she felt alive, truly alive. And the throne of Velthara, it had collapsed. Without ceremony, without warning. The decision had been made before Cal'zhar spoke a word. The council's decree came swiftly, as brutal as it was inevitable. Ayla was to be detained, a destabilizing influence, a threat to the very structure of Viroxxian power. But as the order of arrest was issued, something even more shocking happened. Cal'zhar, High Lord, eternal ruler, God, rose from his seat and turned his back on them all. Without a word to anyone, he moved toward Ayla. The air in the chamber rippled with shock and fury, but he paid it no mind. He reached for her hand with the same quiet intensity that had once belonged to the gods. Without hesitation, he pulled her close, and they fled. The chamber doors slammed open. The Viroxxian guards, too stunned to react, stood paralyzed. The High Lord, reduced to a fugitive, broke through his own empire's defenses. They fled through the spire's lower levels, past corridors where stars flickered like dying flames. And then they found it, an ancient vessel long forgotten in the depths of the Viroxxian archives. A living ship, untethered to any empire, free from the expectations of gods or men. Ayla didn't question it. She followed him, without looking back. As the ship powered up, it sailed into the void of space, leaving Velthara's orbit behind. The stars, which had once seemed so cold and distant, dimmed in their wake. But ahead of them, new stars were born, and in the silence of their flight, something new began. Not an empire, not a rule, but freedom. The dead lattice was a forgotten system, hidden on the fringes of known space. A place marked by the remnants of a psionic war that had torn its stars into nothingness, leaving behind only echoes of the lives once lived there. The planets were barren, hollowed out by psychic storms, and the moons had long since ceased their orbits, drifting aimlessly in the void. For Ayla and Cal'zhar, it was a sanctuary. The lattice offered nothing: no politics, no power, no gods. Here they could be nothing more than who they were in the quietest corners of the universe. Fugitives, yes, but also something more, something human. They landed in the largest of the system's moons, a dead world riddled with craters and ancient ruins, remnants of an era long lost. Ayla stepped off the ship, her boots crunching against the shattered ground. The air was thin, the atmosphere weak, but the emptiness felt comforting. The sky stretched above them in a dark, endless expanse, the stars whispering in their cold, distant language. Cal'zhar stood beside her, his cloak fluttering in the breeze. the fabric still shimmering with quantum-encoded laughter. It seemed to weigh him down now, this reminder of something too human for him, too fragile. He looked out across the ruins, his shoulders heavy, his mind elsewhere. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice raw, unpolished. "I've lived for centuries, led an empire, and yet I don't know how to exist without a throne." Ayla didn't speak at first. She simply reached out and placed her hand in his. The contact, so simple, so intimate, was the answer he had been seeking. "Then let's just be," she said softly. And for the first time in his existence, Cal'zhar allowed himself to simply be. The attempt at romance was awkward, uncomfortable, and in some ways entirely absurd. Cal'zhar, the godlike aristocrat, had done his best to learn what love meant among the human species. He scoured archives, studied customs, and enlisted the help of the rogue HFY that had once translated Viroxxian etiquette. And so, in the cold silence of the dead lattice, he attempted to recreate Earth's most sacred ritual, a romantic evening. Ayla watched in bemusement as he fumbled with the candlelight. The small, flickering flames cast strange shadows on his alien features. He arranged them with painstaking precision, the soft glow casting an eerie hue over his golden skin. Then came the dance, a series of awkward movements that could barely be called steps. Cal'zhar, towering and regal, tried to mimic the slow sways of human ballroom. His long limbs flailed, as if he was unfamiliar with his own body. Each gesture was stiff, formal, as though every motion had been read from a data slate and not from instinct. Ayla couldn't help herself. She burst into laughter, the sound ringing out in the hollow space of the dead lattice. "You look ridiculous," she said between breaths, her voice cracking with amusement. Cal'zhar froze mid-step, his gaze meeting hers, searching for any hint of mockery. But there was none, only affection. "You laughed at me once," he replied softly. "It made me live." Ayla wiped away a tear from her eye, still smiling. "Well, you made me laugh, so I suppose we're even." For the first time, the tension that had gripped them both loosened. This strange, broken human romance was real. The living ship they had fled to, now orbiting a dead moon in the far reaches of the dead lattice, hummed with quiet energy. Its heartbeat not with mechanical pulse, but with the quiet power of ancient organic technology, an entity more alive than most of the empires they had left behind. In its hum, Ayla and Cal'zhar found an unusual peace, but peace, like everything else in the galaxy, could not last. The transmission they had sent, one made not of cold treaties or empire-building declarations, but of raw, emotional truth, had shattered the quiet universe they had hoped to escape. Ayla stood before the broadcast terminal, the holographic projector casting the two of them in stark light. Her face was raw with defiance, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "He spat on me," Ayla began, her words carrying through the broadcast. "They called it an honor, but we gave it meaning, not ritual, not you, not the Viroxxian Imperium." Her voice echoed through the expanse of space, piercing the silence of countless systems, cutting through centuries of tradition. Behind her, Cal'zhar remained silent, a figure of both power and vulnerability. His presence was undeniable, but it was her words, her rebellion, that carried the weight. "The High Lord's spit," she continued, "was a gift, not because of some divine ritual, but because we chose to give it meaning." Her voice wavered for a fraction of a second, but she steadied herself. "We gave it the meaning of truth, and you will not silence that." The broadcast rippled across the stars, captured by every species. Across the galaxy, alliances fractured. Some felt their gods tremble. Others felt emboldened, their own voices rising in rebellion. The untouchable High Lord was no longer a symbol of invulnerability. He was human, and together they had dared to shatter the foundations of a dying empire. The transmission had ignited a wildfire. Across the galaxy, in hidden spaces and open forums, whispers turned to conversations, and conversations erupted into rebellion. It wasn't just the message of Ayla and Cal'zhar's defiance that struck a chord. It was the very emotion that flowed through it, raw and unrestrained. A new movement began to form, one not born from conquest or power, but from the daring vulnerability they had shared. On distant worlds, the aristocratic houses began to fracture. The old ways no longer held the same weight. Leaders who had once seen emotion as a weakness now secretly gathered in dim chambers, quoting Ayla's words and finding in them a new form of strength. Even in the cold, distant reaches of the Viroxxian court, there was a stirring. Artists and poets took to the streets, their works bold and filled with defiance, their cries for change reverberating through the void. The doctrine of feeling, as it was soon called, was not about love in the romantic sense. It was about something far more radical. It was about truth, rawness, and the power to feel, to be human, in a universe that had long suppressed such emotions. Empires that once thrived on rigid protocol now faltered, their leaders unsure of how to react to this new wave of sentiment. Ayla's name became both a symbol of rebellion and a rallying cry for those who had long felt oppressed by the cold, calculated ways of the aristocracy. She was offered leadership, a title she had no interest in holding. "You can't lead what must remain wild," she said, rejecting the idea. The movement had to remain untamed, free from the very chains that had once enslaved it. The galaxy was changing. The walls of control were crumbling. The stars were vast, but they had never felt so small. Ayla and Cal'zhar sat at the edge of a black hole horizon, the ship drifting lazily through the cosmic void. No titles, no thrones. Just two beings suspended in the silence of space. In that stillness, time felt warped, as if it had bent and twisted, folding them into something they could no longer understand. Cal'zhar, the once immortal High Lord, had shed the last of his cold exterior. Ayla, the human who had dared to laugh at him, at everything, had become something more than an emissary. Together they had changed the universe, though neither could truly fathom what that meant yet. Ayla's fingers brushed the surface of the black hole horizon, the feeling of her hand against the cold, distant universe somehow grounding her. Cal'zhar's gaze followed her movements, tracing the delicate line of her arm. It was no longer the gaze of a ruler or a god. It was the gaze of someone who was, perhaps for the first time in his life, just another person, uncertain and vulnerable. He reached out slowly. His long fingers hovered above hers as if testing the waters. When he finally made contact, it was tentative, a simple touch. His hand, once a symbol of infinite power, shook ever so slightly. Ayla's eyes met his, and for a moment there was no galaxy between them. No empires, no centuries of tradition, no systems of control. There was only this, them, and the fragile understanding that had blossomed between them. The quiet, unspoken promise of something deeper than mere alliance or love. "I am no god," Cal'zhar murmured, his voice soft, raw, breaking through the stillness. Ayla smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "That's why I stayed," she whispered. The ship drifted onward, and for the first time in their journey, the stars didn't seem so far away. They weren't alone anymore.